Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how you can build out the property on your server and then implement that property into your database. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is go and create some new models. So head to your models folder and create a new one called apartment. And the first thing we need to do is declare the package, which is models, then import GORM. Next, create your struct for apartment, and then give it the defaults for a model. Then we'll assign it a property ID, unit, bedrooms, and bathrooms. Next, create a model for property, and declare the package as models, import GORM, then create the property struct, give it the defaults for model, and then assign it a unit type, property type, street, city, state, zip, lat, long, bedroom low, bedroom high, bathroom low, bathroom high, manager ID, and apartments. Now we need to navigate to our user, and we can actually get rid of this manager reference, and we'll go into our manager model, and here we need to specify that the manager is associated to a user or belongs to one user. So instead of having a one-to-many relationship, we're just going to have a one-to-one relationship between user and manager. And then we need to say that a manager can have multiple properties, so that's what we're doing here. So with the user to manager relationship changed, we need to go and change a function within our manager roots. It is going to be the second one, get managers by user ID. Let's rename this to get manager by user ID. We no longer need this slice, so we'll get rid of that. We can rename this to manager. And instead of returning this, let's just return manager if the rows affected is greater than 0. So here we can say manager exists is going to be equal to storage.db.where user ID is equal to the passed in ID. We're going to find the manager, and beneath this we'll say that if the rows affected is equal to 0, then we will send the user a status of 400 saying that the manager was not found. So now we need to go and modify this function name in main.go. And we need to navigate back to our application code. And we are getting this data here. So manager query.data.data.managers.length. So this would typically be that array that we just had. So we can get rid of that. And we'll just keep this second option, and here we'll say .data, and here we need to set retry to false within our options, because if we don't do that, it's going to retry the fetch 5 separate times, because we are going to be returning a status of 404. So let's just set retry to false here. And then let's change this name so that instead of get managers by user ID, it's just get manager by user ID. And let's go make that corresponding change here. And now let's go back to our server code, and let's begin creating the routes for creating a property. So go into your routes folder and create a new file called property.go. Let's specify the package, then add some imports of our models, storage, utils, and iris. Next, let's create a function for creating a property. And now let's create these structures for what the input should look like. So the first one is going to be property input. It'll have a unit type, property type, street, city, state, zip, lat, long, manager ID, and apartments. And an apartment input will have a unit, bedrooms, and bathrooms. Now within create property, we need to create a property input variable and then read the JSON that's passed in and handle any errors for validation. And if the input is valid, let's create an apartment slice and then create some variables for bedroom low, bedroom high, bathroom low, and bathroom high. And then we need to map through each element within this apartment slice. And if the current amount of bathrooms is less than the bathroom low, we're going to assign bathroom low to the current amount of bathrooms within this apartment. And then same thing for bedroom low, and vice versa for bathroom high and bedroom high. And then we'll append the apartment to our apartments variable up here. Now after mapping through all of the elements, we will create a property and then store that in our database, then send that off to the user. Now we need to create a function for getting a property by its ID. So let's create that. We'll call it getProperty. And then we need to get the parameters passed in with the URL and specifically get the ID that's passed in. And then we need to create a property variable. And then we will query our database and join any apartments associated with that property whenever we are querying the database for that particular ID. And if we get an error during that process, we'll send to the user a status code of 500. And if the property doesn't exist, we'll send the user a status code of 404. Otherwise, we'll send the property back to the user. So with these created, go back to main.go and create a new party called property. And within that, we'll create a create endpoint, passing in the create property function. And then we'll create a endpoint for getting that property by its ID. And we'll pass in the get property function. Now with that done, we need to go back to our database file and add in the new tables that we just created, or the new models I should say, and that will create tables for apartment and property. And we need to delete the table for manager. So let's go here, and underneath manager, we need to add in property and apartment from our models. Now I'm going to go back into my database GUI, and here I'm going to drop the tables. I happen to already create the properties and apartments tables, but I need to drop managers. Okay, so with those tables dropped, let's go back to our server code and let's run our server. So with our server up and running, let's navigate to our application code. And I'm going to navigate to create a new manager. So go to the add a property screen. And here I get sent to the create property manager account. So this is working. If yours isn't working, just go ahead and log out to clear your cache. So you'd go here, sign out, and then sign back in, and that'll clear your query cache. But for me, it's working. So let's go and add a property, which means create a manager here. Here we'll just say North Star Properties. Now let's create this account. So here we need to create a mutation within our add property section so that we can go and utilize those endpoints that we just created on our server. So before we do any of that, let's go and add those endpoints to our constants file. First, we need to create a new variable for property. Then we'll create the property endpoint. And finally, we'll create the create property endpoint and get property by ID endpoint. We need to go back to our add property section and import Axios, use mutation, use query client, and use navigation. Then create variables for query client and navigation. And then we need to create a variable for getting our manager, because that's going to be useful information whenever we submit the property to our server. And we need to go and create a manager type. So navigate to your types folder and create a new manager file. And within this file, we'll first import property, then we'll export the type manager, and we'll give it an ID, name, email, user ID, phone number, website, image, and properties. Now let's go back to the add property section and import manager. And next we'd like to create a create property mutation. But before we do that, let's go and create a type for the create property input. So I'm just going to go into the property types here, and we'll create a new type called create property. And within this type, it should have a unit type, property type, street, city, state, zip, lat, long, manager ID, and an array of apartments, which are just objects with a unit, bedrooms, and bathrooms. Now we can go and create our create property mutation. So let's create that variable here called create property and call the use mutation hook. The key is going to be property. The function is going to be an asynchronous one, taking in an object that is of the type create property. And within this function, we'd like to return a post request to our create property endpoint, passing in the object that gets passed into this function. So let's import this endpoints from constants. Then we would like to handle the on error and on success options for this mutation. So on error, we will just alert a message to the user saying that we were unable to create the property. And on success, we need to get the data from this function, and we need to navigate to a new screen. So we'll say navigation.navigate to a new screen we'll create. It's going to be called edit property, and it's going to need to take in a property ID. So this is going to be equal to data.data.id, and here let's specify the type. So it's going to have a data object, which is going to be the type of property. And here we can also specify that this is going to be property as well. And now we're getting this error because edit property doesn't exist. So let's go and create that screen. And within the screen, let's import text, Axios, use query result, loading, screen, endpoints, and property. And let's export our component. Let's destructure for the route, which will have params and then property ID. And within this function, we need to call the use query hook, and it will have a key of property. And with it, we will just make a GET request to the get property by ID endpoint, passing in the property ID that was passed in to the screen. And if the property is fetching or is loading this property query, then we need to return loading. Otherwise, we will return a screen with some text which just says edit property screen, and then some JSON showing the property data. And here I'm going to move this down one. Now let's go to our index file, and let's add it to this stack group. It's going to be called edit property, and we just need to import this screen. Now let's go to our types, and let's copy this, change add to edit, and get rid of this or undefined. And here, let's save this and go back to the add property section. And now we just need to create a function for this onSubmit event. So I'm going to call it onSubmit. And it's going to take in these values, so let's just copy them. And units here is just going to be like this, except that it will have a field called unit, which will be a string. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that we have a manager. Then we'll create a new object of the create property type based upon these values. And then based upon whether or not the unit type is equal to multiple or single, we need to push different things into this apartments array. So if it's multiple, we'll loop through all of the units, so this array, and then we will pass in the different values. And here, because this is a picker item, we need to specify the value for bathrooms and bedrooms. Otherwise, if it's single, if the unit type is single, then we just need to push the bathrooms and bedrooms from unit. So this one. And here at the end, we just need to call createProperty.mutate, passing in this object. So with this created, I'm going to minimize it and then go into here for the format component and call it, so onSubmit, passing in values. And now we can test this out. So let's create a multiple unit space, and I'm going to go into data, and we're going to use this 1170 Northwest 11th Street. And here we can see the results. So let's see, the bathroom low is 0.5, bathroom high was 3, bedroom high was 5, and the bedroom low was 0 because we had a studio. So this is working out, and now that property is stored in our database. So that is how you can create properties on your back end and implement that with the front end of your app. So in the next video, we're going to be making this edit property screen pretty so that users can edit their property further and then eventually post it so that other users can see their property. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned for the next one, and thank you for watching.